What would you do if the only proof of who you were had been locked away for 30 years, and the man holding the key had just told the whole town you were a liar? We want you to sit with that for a moment, because that is exactly where Ivy Crane found herself on a Tuesday morning in the town of Harlan's Crossing, Missouri, with mud on her boots, her late teacher's brass plumb bob in her coat pocket, and not a single soul in that courthouse willing to meet her eyes. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let us start at the beginning, the way all the best stories deserve to be told. Ivy Crane had been 22 years old when the world took the last thing she had left. Her mother had gone before she was old enough to remember her face. Her father had followed when Ivy was 9. A mill accident, they said, quick and indifferent as weather. After that, there had been a series of relatives who kept her the way people keep something inconvenient, at arm's length, in a back room, grateful for her labor, and uncomfortable with her presence. By the time she was 15, she had stopped expecting warmth from any of them, and had made her peace with the cold. What saved her, and we mean this without the least exaggeration, was an old woman named Dorothea Fenn. Dorothea Fenn ran the only surveying and cartography shop in 3 counties, out of a narrow stone building on the edge of Harlan's Crossing, that always smelled of pine resin and ink. She was 70, wiry, and carried herself with the economy of motion of someone who had spent decades measuring the exact distance between one thing and another. She had no children. She had no patience for foolishness, and for reasons she never fully explained, she had taken one look at the 15-year-old girl sweeping the sidewalk outside the dry goods store and offered her an apprenticeship. "You have good hands," Dorothea had told her. It wasn't a compliment. It was an assessment. Ivy had learned everything inside that narrow stone shop. She learned how to read a transit level, how to calculate bearing and grade, how to fold a field map so it could be unfolded again without tearing. She learned how to listen to land, the way water moves underground, the way a slope breathes after rain, the way the earth will tell you where it has been disturbed if you know how to ask. Dorothea was not a gentle teacher. She corrected without softening and expected Ivy to correct herself twice as fast the next time. Ivy loved her for it, in the way that you can only love someone who treats your potential as a fact rather than a hope. When Dorothea Fenn died, quietly, in her sleep, in the winter of Ivy's 21st year, she left the shop to a nephew in Cincinnati who arrived 3 weeks later, sold the equipment at auction and locked the door. He was not unkind, exactly. He simply didn't understand what had happened in that building, and understanding was not his business. He let Ivy keep her tools. That much, at least, he did. She kept them rolled in the same canvas wrap Dorothea had used. 3 measuring tapes, a set of drafting pens, a folding rule, and the brass plumb bob that Dorothea had carried in her vest pocket every day of her working life. It was a small, heavy thing, perfectly weighted, its surface worn smooth from decades of use. Ivy kept it in her coat pocket where she could feel it against her palm. It helped her think. She found work where she could. A surveying crew out of Jefferson City hired her for the season, and she was good enough that they kept her through the winter. But the foreman, a thick-necked man named Pruett, did not believe that a woman ought to hold the transit level, and made his opinion known daily and loudly. She endured it until spring, then took her wages and moved on. She was in this way, moving, enduring, surviving, when she arrived back in the county of her childhood and heard, almost by accident, about the Kettlemore estate. The Kettlemore land was a stretch of river bottomland and timber upland that had sat in legal dispute for 3 years since old Silas Kettlemore died intestate. The heirs were a bramble, a grown son from a first marriage, 2 daughters from a second, and a nephew who claimed to have a handwritten codicil giving him the lion's share. The county court had ordered the land to be formally surveyed and the boundaries established before any division could proceed. The job had been offered to 2 different firms. Both had backed out after the nephew, a man named Conrad Kettlemore, who served as city alderman in the county seat and owned the feed mill and the grain elevator, made clear that he expected the survey to confirm his interpretation of the boundaries. Ivy heard this story in a diner outside of town from a woman who knew the Kettlemore daughters and was not shy about sharing what she knew. Ivy listened carefully, drank 2 cups of coffee, and turned the brass plumb bob over in her fingers beneath the table. She drove to the county courthouse that afternoon and asked to see the original land plat. The plat was a mess. The Kettlemore parcel had been established in 1889 from a government land grant description that used bearing trees as markers, a common practice of the era that became a catastrophe whenever the trees in question rotted, burned, or were simply logged for timber. 3 of the 5 original corner markers were now trees that no longer existed. The 4th was a stream bank that had shifted 40 years ago. The 5th, the only one that remained, was a limestone outcrop described in the original survey as bearing approximately northeast. Approximately. Dorothea Fenn would have underlined that word in red. The courthouse clerk, a thin man named Grayson, who wore his reading glasses on a chain around his neck, watched Ivy spread the plat on the counter, with the polite interest of a man watching a stranger do something he expected to fail. "You planning to take this job?" he asked. "I'm planning to look at the land," Ivy said. "Then I'll decide." She drove out to the Kettlemore property the following morning. The Kettlemore daughters, Mabry, who was 40 and practical, and Jo, who was 36 and kept a careful distance from her own anger, met her at the gate. They were watchful women, the kind who had learned to be. Mabry walked Ivy along the tree line while Jo stayed back, arms folded, watching the road. "Conrad has already had his own man out here," Mabry said. "Put stakes in the ground at the east boundary. His stakes pushed the line 40 feet into our pasture. Where those stakes are now doesn't matter," Ivy said. "What matters is where the original corners were. And can you find them?" Ivy had her transit level on her shoulder and Dorothea's plumb bob in her pocket. She looked out at the timber line and the long, slow curve of the creek that ran through the lower pasture. She could feel the shape of the land the way Dorothea had taught her. Not with sentiment, but with the quiet, attentive patience of someone who understood that ground does not lie, only people do. "Give me a week," she said. The first 3 days were fieldwork. Ivy walked every inch of the Kettlemore parcel, sometimes twice. She drove the transit rod into the earth at what the original bearing description called for, accounting for the magnetic declination shift over 130 years. A correction that required a table, a formula, and the kind of careful arithmetic that looked like nothing to an observer, but was the difference between finding the truth and missing it by 40 feet. She found the first original corner on the 3rd afternoon. It was not a tree. It was the stump of a tree. The heartwood of an old white oak collapsed inward on itself, buried under 60 years of leaf litter, but still there when she dug down 6 inches with a trowel. The heartwood doesn't rot. Dorothea had told her that. The bark goes, the sapwood goes, but the heart holds. She measured outward from it and marked the point with a steel pin. The second corner was a stone. Not the limestone outcrop mentioned in the original plat, which had eroded past recognition, but a dressed sandstone block that she found tipped on its side in the creek bed, moss-covered and invisible, unless you knew what to look for. Surveyors in the 1880s had sometimes set dressed stone at corners on parcels they considered important. This one had a chisel mark on its flat face. A broad arrow, the old government surveyor's mark. She photographed it from every angle. By the end of the week, she had established all 5 original corners. The true east boundary of the Kettlemore parcel ran not through the creek bottom as Conrad claimed, not through the pasture where he had put his stakes, but along a ridge line that placed nearly all the valuable timber acreage firmly on the daughter's side of the line. Conrad Kettlemore's interpretation of the boundary, she calculated, was off by 112 feet at its widest point. She drove to the county courthouse on a Friday morning with her field notes, her photographs, her calculations, and the legal plat she had prepared on drafting paper. The work neat and precise in the manner Dorothea had insisted on, the kind of work that explains itself without having to raise its voice. She had not anticipated what was waiting for her. Conrad Kettlemore was there. She had not known he would be. He stood in the wide corridor outside the county assessor's office with 2 other men. A lawyer in a suit that cost more than Ivy's truck, and a second surveyor Ivy didn't recognize. And his expression, when he saw her come through the door, was the expression of a man who has arranged his furniture very carefully and is mildly annoyed by the presence of someone who doesn't know the room. He did not speak to her directly. He spoke to the clerk. "I understand there's been some amateur work done on the Kettlemore parcel," he said pleasantly, in the carrying voice of a man accustomed to being heard. "I want it on the record that any survey conducted without a licensed firm of record is not valid for submission." The clerk looked at Ivy. Ivy set her tube of rolled plats on the counter. "My license is current," she said. "Missouri State Board of Professional Land Surveyors, number 48 Centon. You can look it up." There was a pause. Conrad's lawyer murmured something to him. Conrad's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. A small recalculation, like a man adjusting to slightly different weather. "There are other concerns," Conrad said. "The methodology. My own surveyor found the original bearing tree at the northeast corner, a white oak still standing. The white oak at that location is a second-growth tree, Ivy said. It's 60 years old at the outside. The original survey was done in 1889. The bearing tree called for in the original description is gone. I found the stump. Anyone can claim to find a stump. Anyone can, Ivy said. I have photographs, soil core samples, and a dendrochronologist's contact information if the court requires confirmation of the species and estimated age of the heartwood. The stump is white oak. The heartwood core suggests a tree that was mature in the 1880s and collapsed sometime in the early 20th century. The lawyer was writing something now. Conrad looked at her for a moment, and the pleasantness in his face thinned slightly, the way a cloud cover thins to let through not warmth but the harder light of a winter noon. You're working for those women, he said. I'm working for the survey, Ivy said. She placed her plats on the counter, and the clerk, Grayson, with his glasses on their chain, began to look through them with the careful attention of a man who has seen a lot of surveys and knows at a glance when one has been done right. The silence in the corridor stretched. Conrad's lawyer asked to see the field notes. Ivy handed them over. He read the first page, then the second. His expression did not become friendlier, but it became less certain, which was not the same thing but was close enough. What happened next was not dramatic. We want to be honest with you about that. The law moves the way rivers move, slowly, with force, grinding the stone to sand over time and not in an afternoon. Conrad did not crumble in the courthouse corridor. The case did not resolve that morning. But something did happen, and we think you'll recognize the weight of it even if the moment itself was quiet. An old man came down the corridor, while Ivy was still at the counter. He was perhaps 80, and he moved with a deliberate care, the kind that speaks of a body that has worked hard for a long time and is now negotiating politely with its own age. He wore a canvas jacket. He had the hands of someone who had spent his life outdoors. He stopped when he saw the plat Ivy had unrolled on the counter. That the Kettlemore parcel, he said. Grayson nodded. The old man looked at the plat for a long moment, then looked at Ivy. You find the dressed stone in the creek bed? Ivy turned. Yes. He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had been waiting a long time to have confirmed. His name, it turned out, was Thaddeus Orrin, and he had done fence work on the Kettlemore land 40 years ago, before the first legal dispute, and the one before that. He had seen the stone. He had known it was a survey marker. He had told Conrad Kettlemore's father at the time, and Conrad Kettlemore's father had told him to move along. I always figured someone would come looking for it, Thaddeus Orrin said, to no one in particular, in the tone of a man who has held a piece of information at arm's length for decades and is relieved to finally put it down. He looked at Conrad. The stone's been there longer than you have, Conrad. Longer than your daddy, too. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before. Let us tell you about the week that came next, because it was not an easy one. Conrad Kettlemore was not a man who accepted correction gracefully. His lawyer filed a motion challenging the admissibility of Ivy's survey on 4 separate grounds. The county court scheduled a hearing. A second surveyor, not the one Conrad had brought to the courthouse, a different one, from a firm in Kansas City, was appointed by the court to review Ivy's methodology and findings. Ivy stayed in Harlan's Crossing. She rented a room above the hardware store from a woman named Patty Vane, who charged fair rates and asked no questions. She worked at the small table by the window in the evenings, reviewing her notes, rechecking her calculations, preparing her documentation for the court hearing with the methodical patience Dorothea had drilled into her. She did not sleep well. We won't pretend otherwise. There were nights when the doubt came in under the door like cold air. The quiet, corrosive kind of doubt that asks not whether you did the work right, but whether it will matter. Whether the truth is the kind of thing that wins when the other side has more money and a longer memory. She would lie in the dark of the room above the hardware store and turn the brass plumb bob over in her fingers, feeling its weight, feeling the smooth brass that Dorothea's hand had worn down before hers. Dorothea had once told her something she had carried ever since. They had been out on a boundary run, a disputed fence line between 2 farmers who had been arguing the case in the county court for 6 years. Ivy had done the work and found the original corner post, and it had settled the line exactly where neither farmer wanted it. Squarely between their preferences, fair to both and satisfying to neither. She had been discouraged. What's the point? She had said, not quite a question, if no one is happy with the answer. Dorothea had leveled her with one of her long measuring looks. The point, she said, is the answer, not whether they're happy with it. At the hearing, the court-appointed surveyor took the stand before Ivy did. His name was Marcus Dell, and he was somewhere in his 50s with a careful, deliberate manner, and the kind of institutional neutrality that comes from years of serving as an expert witness. He had reviewed Ivy's field notes, her photographs, the dendrochronology consultation she had submitted, and the plat itself. He answered the court's questions evenly. When the judge asked whether, in his professional opinion, the survey methodology was sound, Marcus Dell said, "Yes, Your Honor, it is." When the judge asked whether the corner evidence was sufficient to establish the original boundaries of the Kettlemore parcels, Marcus Dell said, "The dressed stone is definitive. The heartwood stump, taken in conjunction with the other evidence, corroborates the boundary line the submitted survey establishes. I would not have done the work differently." Conrad's lawyer asked several questions on cross-examination. Marcus Dell's answers did not change. Then it was Ivy's turn. She took the stand with her field notes in front of her, the way Dorothea had taught her, organized, tabbed, ready to open to any page in under 10 seconds, because the court does not wait for you to find what you're looking for. Conrad's lawyer questioned her for 40 minutes. He questioned her license, her experience, her methodology, her motives. He was skilled, and some of his questions were good ones, the kind that required her to know her own work precisely without approximation. She answered every one of them. She did not rush. She did not become flustered. When a question required a long answer, she gave it. When it required a short one, she gave that instead. At one point, the lawyer asked her why, given the challenges to her findings, she was confident in her conclusions. Ivy thought of Dorothea. She thought of the brass plumb bob in her coat pocket, sitting just outside the courtroom on the bench where she had left her things. "Because I found what was there," she said, "not what someone wanted to be there. The land doesn't negotiate. It just holds the truth until someone bothers to look." There was a pause. Somewhere in the gallery, someone shifted in their seat. The judge looked at her for a moment, and then looked at his papers. "We should tell you talentsy that happened outside the courthouse. That afternoon, after the hearing was done, and while the judge was taking the matter under advisement, Mabry and Joe Kettlemore were waiting on the front steps. Mabry had her arms crossed and her eyes were bright in the particular way of someone who has been fighting a long, exhausting battle and is not yet ready to believe it might be over. Joe was very still. "Whatever happens," Mabry said when Ivy came down the steps, "you told the truth of it. That's more than anyone else has done." Joe reached out and pressed Ivy's hand once, firmly, and said nothing. It was enough. Thaddeus Orrin was sitting on a bench across the street. He tipped his cap when Ivy looked over. "Now we want to tell you about the ruling, which came down 11 days later. But first we want to tell you about those 11 days, because they matter too." Ivy stayed in Harlan's Crossing. She didn't know why, exactly. The work was done, the hearing was over, she had nowhere she urgently needed to be. She told herself she was waiting for the outcome. That was true. But there was something else. She took her transit level out to the fields in the mornings, and walked not for any survey, but because the habit of being in the land had become hers in a way that had nothing to do with work. She walked the long way around the old Kettlemore timber line, among trees that were 60 and 80 years old, pressing her hand to the bark of an ancient hickory, looking up through the canopy at the pieces of sky it let through. She thought about Dorothea. She thought about the shop with its smell of pine resin and ink. She thought about what it means to be taught something real by someone who believed you could hold it. She thought, "Whatever happens next, I have done the work right." And she felt the weight of that not as pride. Pride is too light a word, but as something steadier and more durable. The kind of thing that stays with you. The judge's ruling was 42 pages long. We will not read it to you. What it established, in plain language, was this. The original boundary of the Kettlemore parcel ran along the ridgeline Ivy had surveyed. Conrad Kettlemore's east boundary stakes were invalid, placed on land that belonged to his sisters. The timber acreage, some 400 acres of mature hardwood, was confirmed to be part of the sisters' inheritance. The court found that the survey submitted by Ivy Crane, license number 4817, Missouri State Board of Professional Land Surveyors, was accurate, methodologically sound, and properly documented. Conrad Kettlemore left the courthouse that afternoon alone. His lawyer was on his phone before he reached the door. The two men did not walk together down the steps. Mabry Kettlemore cried, quietly, against her sister's shoulder, on the sidewalk outside. Joe held her, and looked at Ivy over her head with an expression that contained a great deal that did not require language to convey. Thaddeus Orrin, who had been in the gallery for the reading of the ruling, found Ivy afterward. "You know," he said, "I was on that fence line 40 years ago. I saw that stone. I always wondered if somebody would come find it. I almost missed it, Ivy said. It was tipped on its side. He nodded. Stones don't stay still forever, neither do people. He shook her hand. His grip was dry and firm, the grip of a man who had spent 40 years deciding when to speak and when to hold his peace, and had made both choices well in his time. Your teacher teach you good, he said. She did, Ivy said. That evening, Ivy sat on the tailgate of her truck in the parking lot of the hardware store and watched the light leave the sky over Harlan's crossing. The town looked ordinary in the dusk, unremarkable. A few lights coming on in the windows, the grain elevator silhouetted against the last of the orange. An ordinary town that had been, for a time, the place where the truth needed to be told, and someone needed to tell it. She took the brass plumb bob from her coat pocket and held it up against the last of the light. It caught the orange and held it. For a moment the brass warm and dense and perfectly weighted, the way a well-made thing is weighted. Balanced. Exactly what it was designed to be. She had come to Harlan's crossing with nothing but her tools and her teacher's careful instructions and the habit of doing the work right. She was leaving with more. Not money. The survey fee was fair and modest, enough to refuel the truck and keep moving. Not fame, not comfort. What she was leaving with was the thing Dorothea had always said the work was actually about. Not the plat, not the certificate, not the legal description filed with the county. The ground doesn't lie, she had said. It holds the truth until someone bothers to look. Ivy had looked. She had found what was there, and she had put it into the record, where it would stay. She thought, not for the first time, that there are people who shape the people who come after them. Quietly, without ceremony, in narrow stone buildings that smell of pine resin and ink, and that the work they pass down outlasts every courtroom, every dispute, every man who ever told a woman in a corridor that her findings were not worth consideration. She closed her fingers around the plumb bob. Its weight was familiar, and sure, and exactly right. She would drive on in the morning. There would be other surveys, other disputed lines, other pieces of ground waiting for someone to ask the right questions and hold steady for the answer. She was good at that. She had been taught. We'll leave her there, on the tailgate in the October evening, the town going quiet around her, and the work behind her standing solid in the county records. We like to think Dorothea Fenn would have looked at that plat and said nothing at all. Just given a single nod. The particular nod of a teacher who has seen the thing she taught take root and hold. We'll ask you this before we go. Was there ever someone in your life who looked at you the way Dorothea looked at Ivy? Not at who you were, but at who you could be. And did they give you something you're still carrying? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone. And if this story moved you, leave a like and subscribe to Fireside Stories, because there are always more of these waiting, the quiet ones, the ones about ordinary people who stood in the right place at the right time and refused to move.